Hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Sam Westrop, Director of Islamist Watch, and Benjamin Baird, Director of Counter-Islamism Grid, here at the Middle East Forum, join us to discuss Muslim Brotherhood Hardly Matters. Sam and Ben will speak for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type out your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Sam Westrop.
Thank you, Stacey. The title, I think, is deliberately provocative. The Muslim Brotherhood, I'm sure most of our audience have heard of. It's not to say it doesn't matter at all. It matters less. Islamist Watch, founded in 2006, was set up to monitor non-violent or lawful Islamism. And lawful Islamism in 2006 was understood rather differently to lawful Islamism as it's understood today. Back in 2006, the threat of Islamism was divided into or delineated into the violent threat, Al-Qaeda, the beginning of rumblings of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and various branches around the Middle East and Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and so on. Lawful Islamism was chiefly known as the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's because of excellent investigative work done by groups like the Middle East Forum, but also by the Investigative Project on Terrorism and other organizations at the time. And what those investigations found were an extraordinary network and infrastructure set up by this Egyptian Islamist organization, this Egyptian Islamist movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, back in the 60s and 70s. And they lay the groundwork for American Islamism as we know it, and were the basis for a lot of the counter-Islamist investigations and studies in the 2000s. But the Muslim Brotherhood is not the only Islamist gang in town. Islam and Islamism is diverse, and this is a point Islamist Watch has made quite a bit over the last few years. It's extremely diverse. It's not just Sunni and Shia. It's hundreds, thousands of movements and sects and groups divided, delineated by theology, by politics, by cultural alignment, by ethnicity, by adherence to certain mysticism, such as Sufism and so on. So Islam is diverse, Islamism is diverse, and the Muslim Brotherhood is just one group. Over the past year and a half, Islamist Watch has made a concerted effort to investigate the other networks operating across the United States. A plurality of American Islam is South Asian, and with South Asian Islam comes along South Asian Islamism. So we have groups like Jamaat-e-Islami, often thought of as the South Asian cousin of the Muslim Brotherhood. Jamaat-e-Islami operates all around the country, both a Bangladeshi component, a Pakistani component, and even a small Indian component. We found them last year. We found that they were tied to a terrorist organization in Pakistan. That is, we found an American proxy of Jamaat-e-Islami, a group called the Islamic Circle of North America, and it's a branch that it's set up called Helping Hand for Relief and Development. We discovered ties to Kashmiri jihadists. That led us into looking to groups like the Deobandis, another very important South Asian sect, sometimes referred to as a sort of South Asian version of Salafism, but that's a bit of a simplification. But Deobandi mosques have been ever present in various radicalization cases across the US for the last few years. Extraordinarily, no one had looked at them before, despite there being this enormous network in the United States filled with seminaries and schools and various religious training programs and youth groups and community groups and so on. There's increasing evidence that Deobandi mosques may be funding Deobandi terrorist organizations in Pakistan and Kashmir, and that's something we're also writing up at the moment, and you should expect to see from us in the next few months. We looked at Tablighi Jamaat, a group that every European and American security official knows who they are because of their ever presence in radicalization and terrorism cases like the Deobandis. Yet no one has really studied the Tablighi Jamaat network. So we started doing that as well. Then there are the Shia Islamists. There are the supporters of Tehran. There are South Asian Shias who support radical Shia Islamism in Pakistan as well. Then we have Malaysia. We have a growing Islamist force there. We're seeing that in the US as well. We've written a number of pieces on a couple of clerics aligned with Malaysian Islamism. And then there's the question of domestic Islamism, by which I mean Islamism that, yes, once perhaps had its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, but has changed over time and no longer listens to orders in Cairo or takes command or instructions from anyone in Doha or Ankara. No, they've developed their own ideology that certainly has its base, has its foundations in the Islamism of the Middle East and the Islamism of South Asia, but has taken on distinctly American characteristics, including a curious alliance with progressivism that has genuinely fused. You know, there are now today across the country activists and groups who advocate for various aspects of, say, Sharia law, while also attending gay rights marches without any sense of paradox, without any sense of confusion. Islamism is evolving and changing. And because of that change, there's of course a backlash to that change, there's a reaction to that change. And so now we're seeing groups from the Salafi tradition, which is the purest revivalist Middle Eastern hardline conservative Islam. We're seeing them revolt against these changes, against this embrace of ideas they consider to be deeply un-Islamic. And we're seeing new Islamist forces come out of that. So Islamism is dramatically revising itself and evolving, changing, and we're following it, we're studying it. We've written quite a few pieces this year on this very question. We're very closely looking at these new groups set up, these new networks. We're looking at how money plays into that. We're looking at the transfer of finances between organizations, between foreign states and domestic organizations. We're able to take a much broader view of Islamism in the United States and how it's operating. It is a mistake to still talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. It is particularly a mistake to use the words Muslim Brotherhood to refer to Islamism more generally. And that's something that I think our entire sort of counter-Islamist industry has been a little guilty of the last 10, 20 years. Islamism is much more complicated and much more interesting than that. And we're working hard to find out exactly how much and to what extent these lesser known groups are involved, not just in questions of radicalization and terror, but also just of extremism and radical and turning a next generation of American Muslims into a more politicized community. And that's something we fear and something we're working against. We've got a number of projects that do all these things. And in a second, my colleague Benjamin Baird will mention our Islamism in Politics project and our Counter-Islamist Grid initiative. I just wanted to give you three very quick examples of particular projects you should expect to see from us in the next few months. Firstly, I mentioned Jamaat-e-Islami and the Deobandis, the South Asian Islamist movement. Well, the entire Islamist scene has, over the last year, refocused a lot of its efforts from Israel and the Palestinian territories to India and Kashmir. Now, this is outside, geographically, this is outside the Middle East Forum's area of focus. And so while we're not particularly interested in the politics of Kashmir, we are very interested in the fact that Western Islamists, including Middle Eastern inspired Islamists, are shifting their attention to Kashmir. And groups like American Muslims for Palestine and CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and ICNA, the group earlier that is the Jamaat-e-Islami proxy I mentioned, these groups are now obsessing over Kashmir. They're launching boycott, divestment, and sanctions efforts. They're inventing massacres that didn't happen and convincing Western media to write about it. Sound familiar? This is exactly what the Islamists did with the Palestinian territories for the last 20, 30 years. Something very new and interesting is happening in American Islam. They're expanding their horizons. Now that may be because they have fewer allies in the Middle East that allow them to push the anti-Israel angle as much as they once did. But Kashmir, India, is a new focus, and we should expect to see that. So we're working on a couple of pieces examining the anti-India, pro-Kashmir network that grew out of American Islamism, and how it's tied both to terrorists in the East and extremists here in the West. So expect that from us over the next few weeks. In fact, we've got something coming out very shortly. We're continuing to look at financing, as I mentioned. We have scraped cross-checking against tens of thousands of Islamist organizations and individuals. We have scraped government databases looking for government spending details, working out how much taxpayers' money is going to the hands of extremists. And if you saw a recent piece of ours on how COVID funding from the Small Business Administration, loans and grants, have ended up in the hands of some of the most horrifying extremists operating in the US today. If you haven't seen that, I do recommend checking it out. It's on the Islamist Watch website at meforum.org. And then also one thing that's been sorely missing from our work over the last, well, in fact, since Islamist Watch was founded, is a look at Shia Islamists in the West. We've done bits and bobs from time to time, but by and large, Shia Islamism has been ignored. And it is a substantial network in the US, especially in places like Michigan, Dearborn, but also, and not just aligned with Iran, but aligned, as I mentioned earlier, with South Asian Islamists, but also with Lebanese and Hezbollah networks as well, operating all across the US. And law enforcement is taking a very aggressive view towards Iranian and Hezbollah networks at the moment in the United States. It makes sense that we should be following up by looking at the extremism side of this, the lawful Islamist side of these networks, which move millions of dollars around between institutions and move money to the Middle East and back from the Middle East. This is a big network with a lot of activity. And we plan a series of really hard-hitting investigative work into this network over the next few months. I could go on, but I'm going to stop because I'm speaking too much. And I think now, Ben, would you like to tell them about Islamism and politics and the Counter-Islamist Grid?
Absolutely. So Islamism and politics and the Counter-Islamist Grid are two of the Middle East Forum's newer projects. The Counter-Islamist Grid uses researchers and activists to counter and expose Islamism at the local level. Islamism and politics kind of grew out of our Islamist money and politics, where we tracked political donations from Islamist sources, both individuals and organizations. And it works at countering Islamism at the really the local, state, and federal level. We try to pay particular attention to the local and state level, where we find that many people who keep an eye on these things, many counter-Islamists, haven't necessarily been focusing so much on local politics insofar as Islamism is concerned. But Islamists definitely have found a foothold in local politics by running races, running elections, campaigning at the local level, both at school board races, county commissioners, judgeships. So, you know, they've been very active at the local level, and we're working to sort of counter this. Now, we find that many, since they're both very localized, the Counter-Islamist Grid and IIP, both sort of overlap in their mission in many ways. So we work together to do this. Both projects overlap, and you know, we work together to counter at the local level. One thing we've noticed, as Sam mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood type groups aren't as active, or at least as active. They may be ideologically inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood. However, we're finding that state actors have been taking a more active role in working with these groups, whether it be CARE or ICNA, the Islamic Circle of North America, Islamic Society of North America. We find that all of them have sort of found patronage from Islamist regimes overseas. And one of those is Turkey, who has been very active in influencing local Islamist groups in America. One of the ways they're doing this lately is through a series of political action committees that together, it's 5 PACs that together are called the 10,000 Turks campaign. And what we found by looking at donors who give to these PACs is that many of its donors are involved with civil society organizations which basically work on behalf of a Turkish agenda. We find that some of them have been part of the Turkish embassy and are actually registered foreign agents now. Some have been part of FBI investigations to see if they are in fact working on behalf of the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. One donor to this pack, Ibrahim Danishmaz, actually left the US and went to Turkey after an FBI investigation. Now, there were warnings of this in 2016. The Clinton campaign, it was revealed in WikiLeaks emails, actually was warned that, hey, some of Erdogan's proxies in America are trying to influence US politics. As a result, they were told not to give to, or not to take money from some Turkish Americans who actually happen to be heavily involved in the 10,000 Turks campaign. So that's something we've been working on. We're actually letting politicians know that, especially those who took money from the 10,000 Turks campaign, that look, you're actually being influenced here by Turkish regime proxies. We ask that they either return the donations or refuse to accept donations from these groups in the future. There were WikiLeaks emails also in Turkey that revealed really a substantial operation. It was the Turkish Heritage Organization, which was founded a few years back. THO, when it was being founded, Ibrahim Danishmaz was exchanging emails with Turkish officials talking about how they want to establish sort of a lobbying front in the US that would look like it's a nonprofit, that would look like its mission was public education, but instead it was designed to sort of promote the Turkish agenda. So there's no question that these groups are working on behalf of Turkey and Erdogan. We've been trying to take steps to mitigate that. The Counter-Islamist Grid has also worked to take on Turkish influence in America. One of Turkey's main goals is to sort of counter the narrative that there was an Armenian genocide during World War I. The Counter-Islamist Grid has published articles that sort of explain what happened. Turkey has, part of its pacts and through some of its groups, has worked very heavily to fund politicians who will sort of promote their idea on the Armenian genocide that, it never happened, or at least that it didn't just happen to Armenia, that Turkey was also victims during World War I as part of the Ottoman Empire. So that's another thing we're doing. Now, Sam talked about how many of these groups are no longer aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. One of these groups, the American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, continues to be active and sort of, supporting the Palestinian national agenda. And one of the ways they've done this is to sort of hold a lobby day in the nation's capital. Every year they've done this the past few years to try to sort of get politicians to support a number of legislation that sort of demonizes Israel. They've done this for many years. However, this year, because of the coronavirus pandemic, they were forced to hold their lobby online. It was a virtual Palestinian advocacy day, they called it. So members of the Counter-Islamist Grid sort of registered for this event. As a result, we were able to infiltrate their legislative meetings with members of Congress and really counter their agenda. We weren't so much concerned with the Palestinian-Israel conflict. However, we did want lawmakers to know that this is a group, for instance, that the Anti-Defamation League considers to promote an anti-Israel agenda and provide a platform for anti-Semitism. As we let lawmakers know this, some of them actually identified with us and told the AMP lobbyists that, hey, Hamas is not a suitable partner for peace in the region. This made some of the AMP lobbyists furious, as you can imagine, and they started bickering with some of the legislative aides. So we were really able to, what I like to say, crash Palestine Advocacy Day, which AMP held. Now, again, AMP isn't necessarily a Muslim Brotherhood front anymore. Although they were founded as a part of the Islamic Association of Palestine, and several of its board members are still active with AMP. What we find is really, like many American Islamist groups, they're taking patronage from Turkey. During several of their events, for instance, they had a protest in Washington, D.C., where the AMP supporters chanted Erdogan's name and said that he was the ruler of the Muslim Ummah. There's members of AMP, Hatem Bazian, for instance, is a regular contributor to Turkish media in the U.S., which really is a AKP front. So this is another way that we've taken on sort of foreign actors in the U.S. We plan to continue that in the future with several activities we have planned.
All right, thank you both so much for speaking with us. We have quite a few questions coming in. First one is, what would you say is the most influential Islamist network in the world right now?
That's a good question. Again, I think the sheer diversity of Islamism makes that an impossible question to answer. It depends on the region, it depends what the kind of Islam, the caliber of Islamism we're talking about. Is it terroristic? Is this political and quietist? Is this aggressive and activist based? So I'm going to, unfortunately, answer your question without an answer. Just from the position of the US, the United States, I would say two groups are the most powerful. In other words, the organizations that currently run American Islamism, I would suggest, are one, what we call modernist Salafism, this new breed of Salafism that's grown to a leadership position in the last few years, along with then a hybrid mix of Jamaat-e-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood and Deobandis, all of whom now are working together more closely than ever, whereas once they were divided by theological and political disagreements. Now they've overcome a lot of these divisions to in pursuit of what they call the United Ummah, the United People. So it's a complicated question. In the US, yeah, the Salafis and the Islamists. I do recommend, we published 2 months ago, I think, a guide to American Islamism. It's on the front of the Islamist Watch Project website at emiforum.org. And it gives a brief rundown of the main Islamist groups active in the United States. It's not comprehensive, it doesn't have everything, but it has a significant amount of information. So I do recommend you check that out.
Thank you so much. So no doubt that kinds and organizations of Islamism change. Do you think that the Egyptians or Saudis consider the Muslim Brotherhood as lawful Islamists, or often Turks behind them?
I'm sorry, what was the last bit to that question?
Or often Turks behind them.
Behind the Brotherhood? Okay, so the Muslim Brotherhood today is primarily based in Doha and Ankara, in Turkey and Qatar. In 2013, the UAE, the Emirates, and Saudi turned against the Brotherhood. That coincided with the fall of Mohammed Morsi in Egypt, the short-lived Muslim Brotherhood president. Now, today, the Middle East is thoroughly divided on this question. Saudi and the Emirates and Egypt regard the Muslim Brotherhood not just as lawful Islamists, but as a terrorist organization. Obviously, there are other politics at play here that lead, especially a Wahhabi state like Saudi Arabia, to say such things. Qatar, meanwhile, pushes, even though Qatar is technically a Wahhabi state, it pushes the Muslim Brotherhood agenda around the world, including here in the US, both financially and through various media efforts and soft power in universities and so on. Turkey has its own ideology. Erdogan's AKP has a very distinct form of Islamism. It's not the Muslim Brotherhood, it's very different. But they've embraced the Brotherhood as partners. And American Islamism rely on Erdogan and Turkey for money, for support, for partnership. Middle Eastern politics is complicated at the best of times, and when it comes to the question of how it connects and interacts with Western Islamism, it gets even more complicated than that.
Yeah, I should also add that something that sort of embodies these two polarized differences we're seeing in the Middle East is that Turkey's Erdogan has basically said that there's no such thing as moderate Islam. There's only one Islam. And of course, Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman disagrees and promises to return his kingdom to what he calls a moderate Islam. And practice, whether or not that's working, is another question. But there's definitely a disagreement, both in the Middle East and the U.S. among Islamists and Middle Eastern regimes.
Thank you so much. And Ben, I think this next question is for you. What efforts are being made to expose and counteract Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist supporters at the congressional level, as well as the apologists such as Bernie Sanders?
Right, that's a great question. At the congressional level, I think one huge effort that Islamist Watch has taken is to identify the Islamists who are funding congressional races. We've just taken a look at, over 1,000, from a database of over 1,000 Islamists. There were quite a few that have given to congressional campaigns, and we want to expose those. And when they come from radical extremist organizations, we want to let members of Congress know exactly who they are taking money from. Another thing we want to do is to interrupt Islamist propaganda in the United States. The Middle East Forum was quite successful in doing this by being part of an effort to convince the Justice Department to designate Al Jazeera as a foreign agent. Now, recently the Justice Department ended up designating AJ Plus as a foreign agent. This is sort of a savvy online-only format for Al Jazeera. It doesn't push some of the Islamist propaganda that you see from their Arabic language sources and even from some of their Al Jazeera English sources. However, they are very much interested, for instance, in undermining America's democratic institutions, causing us to lose faith in our government. And this is all part of an effort by Islamist regimes, basically to counter American interests. Those are just two examples. There are many more, but those are two successes we've had or continue to have.
Thank you. Why does CARE seem to receive such widespread acceptance in government and private circles in the U.S.?
Good question. Really, in 2008, 2008, when CARE was the Council of American Islamic Relations, when it was named by federal prosecutors as an unindicted co-conspirator in the largest terror finance case in American history, that really should have been the end of CARE in a sane and just world. The Department of Justice instructed the FBI to never deal with them again. Across the board, the federal government started using associations with CARE as ammunition in immigration cases and other court cases. It really should have been the end of CARE. But as we know, it wasn't. And CARE is now today not just one of the leading Muslim organizations in the United States. It's also a very prominent voice in the anti-Trump activism of the last 4 years. In other words, it's become a key part of the progressive fight against Trumpism, not just Trump, but American politics as a whole. And it's no coincidence that CARE is at the forefront of the legal battle against a whole number of executive policies at the moment. So CARE has survived, CARE is accepted, CARE flourishes because CARE made sure not to just be the group that was caught being involved with Hamas and with terrorist organizations. It's survived because it's reformed itself to become not just Islamist, but progressivist as well, not to become not just theocratic, but something that pushes a whole broader range of agendas from which they can find useful partners, not just in the far left, but even in the center. And CARE is very quick to seem reasonable when they can. And scandals like Ahmed's, the clock boy, as it's sometimes referred to, the young child whose clock was reported as a bomb by an overzealous school. CARE was quick to jump on that and be the voice of reason and of outrage there. And it allows them to not just distract from the extremism of the past, to which they were so closely tied, but also to present them in the face of an overzealous security establishment or an overreaching government or an over-paranoid Republican Party. It allows them to seem not just non-extremist, but also sensible. And CARE has done this extremely well. Now, part of that has entailed leaving behind the Muslim Brotherhood, and we have a nice loop now back to my original motif. And that's been a key part of CARE's growth and CARE's change. Here's the interesting thing: today across the country, CARE is staffed by not just these old Muslim Brotherhood Guard types, but also young, fashionable, hijab-wearing, transgender rights supporting activists in CARE branches across the country. This is fascinating. What a mix of two worlds. Yet this symbolizes what CARE is about, the old and the new, East and West. And it is of little surprise that, as I mentioned before, the more traditional Islamists are very unhappy with CARE and very unhappy with what they've become. But it's worked. CARE is now one of the premier civil rights organizations. Absurdly, is one of the most important civil rights organizations in America, and it's widely regarded by all. We continue to fight that. We will continue to expose their hypocrisies, their iniquities. So, stay tuned.
And along those lines, if our viewers would like to support Islamist Watch or CIG, how can they go about doing that?
Well, that's the most important question of all. Please go to middleeastforum.org/participation, or just go to Middle East Forum website and click on the big donate button. There you can select Islamist Watch as the recipient project of your donation. We need all the help we can get. The next few years are going to be extremely bountiful time for American Islamism, not just for Ben's work in Congress and locally around the country, but also in terms of an evolving Islamist threat that will increasingly feed more into radicalization and terror, and will generate an entire radicalized generation of American Muslims. It's vital we step up our efforts now, so any support you can offer is sorely needed and gratefully appreciated.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for coming to speak with us today. We're at the close of our webinar. For our viewers, as you finish up your holiday shopping this year, we would like to remind you that we are a part of the Amazon Smile charity program. You can select the Middle East Forum as your charity, and Amazon will donate 0.5% of the price of eligible purchases to the charity of your choice. So far this year, we have raised over $1,000 through this program. Also, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for an Israel Victory Project update with Navet Dromi. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.